Dobry wieczór Państwu.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to all of you present here in the room with us and to those of us who are connecting online to watch another debate at the Mieroszewski Centre. We are meeting today under the slightly provocative title of Cynics, nihilists, imperialists. So this is a few words about what Russia's approach to international law is. And the starting point for this is a book which we have published about a month ago, which is a book about the Russian attitude to international law. And the book has been written by our guest, who is present here in Warsaw with us tonight, and especially in the current situation to the east of us, the book by Professor Mälksoo is very important. In recent months, there have been many questions about the Russian policy and the Russian attitude to international law and order, and what we should do about it. But before we know what to do about it, we have to understand what it's all about. Our guests are the author, Lauri Mälksoo. The professor is from the University of Tartu, member of the Estonian Academy of Sciences and the European Democracy Committee. He studied in Tartu, Georgetown University in Washington, Humboldt University, a lot of experience and an author of many papers and books on the history and development of international law, especially in Russia and the former Soviet Union. Patrycja Grzebyk is a Warsaw University professor. And again, a very broad range of specialization in terms of international law, from humanitarian aid to the law of conflicts, UN. She's a member of the Falls Committee and Pilecki Institute Scientific Committee and many other institutions and bodies. Igor Grecki is a political scientist who works at the Estonian Institute for Foreign Policy. Until early 2022, he was a professor at the State University in Petersburg. He's a foreign policy analyst dealing with Russia. He deals with foreign relations in our part of the world, and he specialized in Ukraine as well, which is not a very common thing in Russia. So he brings together many different threads some of which are not that common in Russia. I'll start in Polish and then I'll move on to talking to our author and our main guest in English. So this is going to be a mixture, which I apologize for, but I think it's going to be easier for our guests. Yesterday, I had an interview at one of the Polish radio stations, and it was about this meeting today, Russia and international law. And the very first question I was asked was, is there anything to talk about? There it is, a country that for many years has been violating international norms, some of the fundamental things, incessantly, all the time. So what are the sources of it? Is there more to it than just instrumentalizing international norms and standards in order to achieve your own peculiarly understood national interests? The book by Professor Lauri Mälksoo shows that, yes, there is something to talk about. It's not a trivial topic. And I mentioned the cynics and the nihilists in the title of this meeting, people who treat international law instrumentally, but if we only look at it like that, we would be missing out on the essence of things. I suspect that one of the conclusions from the book is that there are certain reasons why this is what Russia's approach to international law is. And this goes back to the USSR times or indeed to the Tsarist times. Let me now switch to English.
I think that this is
Nowego prawa.
why do you these a little bit beyond the usual? It must somehow come from the heart. It must come from our experiences and from our fate. To put maybe use a high word, and my fate is being from Estonia, which is a Western small border state in the neighborhood of Russia, and historically occasionally under Russia. So my reasons to try to understand this through this research were partly selfish. I tried to understand my country's history, my family's history through these sources. They don't come up there directly, but in the end, this is what maybe interested me, because when Estonia has changed hands in terms of sovereignty and territory, of course, international law was used there as a reason, as an argumentation. So, for example, I don't know how much Poles nowadays know about or study about the Great Nordic War, 1700, 1721. The Baltic provinces go at that time from Sweden to Russia, and people know maybe about Peter and the Swedish King Karl XII, but there was also an international law and treaties related arguments related to that law, and Vladimir Hrabar, one of my predecessors at Tartu University as international law professors, he counts that the first Russian kind of original text about international law was a product of this war, when someone from Tsar Peter's court, Shafirov, published a sort of justification for this war. And the other is, of course, yes, maybe, of course, as in academic research, you cannot first have the outcome and then find a proof to it. So this is the amazing part about academic research. Sometimes you find out that your assumptions about something were not exactly what you maybe had to start with. I think natural scientists call it the hypothesis, but history is also a good thing for alternatives. So if we are complaining about Russia, dissatisfied about Russia, then it is worth looking in the history. Were there any alternatives, any different kinds of approaches? And finally, the book, of course, was written before the war. It's not a reaction to the war. It was written in the shadow of Russia's annexation of Crimea. So many of these questions were already in the air very, very much about Russia's attitude to international law, but now it all has become accelerated and amplified further.
Yes, I forgot to mention actually that the English version was published, written before Crimea, but published after, as far as I remember. So it also was released in a very, peculiar period, and that proved its actually significance of the topic. And today I asked Lauri for permission last year, or even earlier, that we would like to publish it in Polish, not knowing, of course, that we will be in such a situation as we are today. And again, now the Polish edition actually is released in a very symbolic moment when it comes to applying the knowledge that comes out of it to the current situation. So thank you. Igor, from your perspective as a political scientist, as someone who has been investigating Russian foreign policy, Russian relations with the direct neighborhood for many, many years, you read the book, you know what it's all about. How can you apply the observations that come from this book to your analysis? How do you see this this phenomenon that you have this Russian politicians' mouths full of law? Actually, I have one quotation actually from Lauri's book. It was by Putin, 2014, right after Crimea. Putin said, international relations must be based on international law, which in turn should be based on moral principles such as justice, equality, and truth. So this is on one hand. On the other hand, we have their hands busy doing lawlessness, actually, unlawful things. How do you approach to this from the perspective of Russian political scientists?
Well, thank you. And I would like to thank Lauri for writing this book, a very interesting one. And I had an opportunity to read it previously. But you're absolutely right. This sounds ridiculous. When we when we articulate this question nowadays, when the war started, it seems that indeed Vladimir Putin and his entourage, they don't actually have any serious understanding what the international law is. You just cited Vladimir Putin, and I think that it's very important to keep in mind when exactly he said that. I do remember when I was driving a car, it was in the end of 2018, and I was listening to the radio. It was Echo Moskwy, something like that. And probably you've heard about this person, Nikolai Svanidze, a very famous historian and publicist. He was a member of the President's Council on Human Rights. And a journalist asked him whether he believed that Putin was able to change the constitution, to break the constitution, to destroy it, in order to prolong his power and to stay in power as long as possible. And he said, no, I don't believe that. Because, he said, Vladimir Putin is a legalist, because he is a lawyer, because he values it. Actually, to him, a law is not just a hollow shell. It is something that's very meaningful. It was the end of the year of 2018. So it was already after the Crimea annexation. So, in my opinion, Nikolai Svanidze actually he overestimated or probably underestimated Putin's attitude with regard to international law. Much of the attitudes, in my opinion, and in Lauri's book, this is stressed. I mean, it was very interesting to me to read this book because I met lots of very familiar names, very kind of experienced professors of international law who personally taught me international law. But the problem was that most of them, an overwhelming majority, they actually taught other subjects during the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union collapsed, actually, there were no generational change when it comes to expertise in international law and international relations. So the people who previously told very good things about communism, they continue lecturing students because for many reasons, because the universities, they could not attract specialists with decent salaries. There were no people who at that time who were in good command with foreign languages. There were no people who were very well integrated in the international process of producing knowledge on the international law. And second reason, so this generational change is the first reason actually why we have the situation with this. And second, there was a certain demand from the Russian population on certain narratives. And one of them is demand for greatness. Demand for greatness. Under the new realities, the Russian population felt frustrated in new circumstances. They were not ready actually to political competition or market economy, and all these fears, they remained alien for the older generation of Russians. Alien. So this generated a demand for certain narratives, and those narratives were used by politicians. And those who occupied the position of experts in international law, what did they do during the Soviet times? Did they do science? Did they do research into the international law? No. What they did is that they actually they were finding arguments in support of the general line. So it is an apology of the general line. So they continued doing it under Boris Yeltsin and under Vladimir Putin. So I would stop here. These are the two main factors.
So instrumental attitude. So I will do a follow-up with question to Lauri after we ask Patrycja about one thing. Now switching into Polish. Pytanie do prawnika, który zajmuje się nie Rosją, ale i historią rozwoju myśli prawniczej, i prawem międzynarodowym, i instytucjami, jak ONZ. Jak z perspektywy, widząc tego rodzaju postawę mocarstwa wobec prawa międzynarodowego?
Looking at this stance of an international superpower is nothing strange. if you look at the approach of superpowers to international law. We know that the international order is a function of a distribution of power in the international system. But when you look at Russia, when you look at its argumentation and earlier its actions, what role do you see for international law? How can actions be evaluated in terms of their impact, efficiency of what we are dealing with, what we have? Should we treat these actions as a symptom of weakness of international law? Or looking at recent events in the United Nations, the General Assembly, which expressed a majority support for Ukraine, even if they were unable to change Russia's policy. But what can international law tell us about this situation? I hope this mic is working. Well, I'd like to say that international law has a lot to say about this situation, and there's a lot of international law in Russian rhetoric, both at international level and domestic level. It was visible if you read the minutes of meetings in the Security Council. Russia is the country that resorted to international law argumentation most often, because international law allowed Russia to grill the West, which in recent decades committed some violations of international law. Russian mentions of international law are also important for domestic policies. The attacks that are reported in Polish media, they are portrayed as obvious violations of international law. I'm studying how they are portrayed in Russian media. It's not that Russian politicians are saying that we can destroy the civilian population, we can destroy cities. No, they always resort to international law explanations. Or they claim that it's sabotage, but Russians would never do something like that. Of course, when we have a case where a great superpower is using force, a member of the Security Council is using force, here international law cannot give us a solution, because the Security Council should make a resolution, but it's blocked. But similar situations have also shown, to refer to your question, that we can develop other mechanisms. It's not that it is a war between the United States and Russia and only their arguments are valid. No, it's important for this international law argumentation to be present among all countries that are commenting on the situation in Ukraine. I remember very well when there was the aggression on the 24th of February this year. The strongest statements came from African states, which were referring to international law. And the fact that the United for Peace procedure was launched. We have a resolution of the General Assembly. We have another resolution condemning the annexation of Ukrainian lands. If you remember, resolutions of the General Assembly are just recommendations. They are not legally binding, but they are legally relevant, because you can refer to them later, raising other arguments and taking other steps. So you can quote the resolution and take action in domestic law on sanctions or criminal proceedings or other steps. So international law in the context of the Russian aggression on Ukraine, it matters hugely, and legal arguments are very visible at international level, domestic level. We are preparing for an international battle of all times at the ICC. We have a dozen or so countries joining Ukraine's side. We are expecting 40 countries, and probably Russia will also find countries to support its position. People seem to think initially that Russia would not be involved in the proceedings, but a few days ago, On the 3rd of October, Russia has filed a letter on its reservations, which delays the proceedings, but it's a testament of the fact that Russia will join the proceedings, that they are going to present their legal case and they will resort to all legal arguments, including the ones that it's been striking at the West over the last decades. So some level of competence on the Russian side exists to use legal argumentation. Yes, clearly, Lauri Mälksoo's books is excellent to demonstrate Russian perspective. It's important for Poles as well, because for many years we've been in the Eastern Bloc. And if we are talking about Polish international lawyers, this older generation, it was raised in the spirit of Russian teaching on international law. We now have new generations, new lawyers. I hope that I'm part of this new generation, but even I was taught by people raised in this old system. And there are certain elements that you will not understand unless you understand what Lauri was trying to explain about the Russian approach to international law. And it also links to the explanation of international law. We are using some patterns of thinking dating back to Russian approach to international law. So Lauri's book provides us an insight into how the Russians perceive international law.
From what Igor said, I think the argument that Russia instrumentalizes international law for many reasons, it's, I mean, the key point. Reading through your book, I saw a lot about this, but also there was a very interesting analysis of actually the longue durée thing. So the legacy of the state as such, the traditions of Russian statehood, the way how it developed throughout last 200 years, actually also had an impact on the way how they approach the international law and how they apply it. So this is the first question about this legacy of the state, of development. How what we see today, I believe, at least it comes out of the book, has deeper roots, not just cynicism of today's times. And the second thing is, you mentioned at the very beginning that you are from Estonia, so part of the former system, occupied part, but the part of peripheries. And right now, I think we have an interesting moment when even the post-Soviet space is in a process of dismantling anything. The post-Soviet divorce has ended, and we have another period actually that has just started. And I would like to know whether you can tell us something about Russian and Ukrainian approaches to international law, because I think that we have this center-focused approach of the metropolis of the empire and the peripheries. I think that I suspect there are now at least some similarities when it comes to the perception of law in Estonia and Ukraine and in Poland. For Poles, international law is interpreted as a shield against the powerful, not for the Moscow right now, rather as a sword, a rhetorical sword or political sword. I mean, have you done some research on that? I would be very much interested.
Well, Ukraine was, of course, quite well. Oh, sorry, I switched this off. Ukraine was quite well integrated in the Soviet Union, in the Soviet Empire, if you want. In some ways, Kiev as an academic center, also in international law, was, holding the place 2 to 3, maybe together with Leningrad, and you can see, there was an international law professor from Kharkiv in the, I think, 1950s and 60s, who became judge in the International Court of Justice, Koretsky, or young politician, there the former Georgian president was a student in this Kiev International Institute of International Affairs in the early 1980s, as, by the way, was on an academic stint the current East European judge in the International Court of Justice, Petr Tomka. So he was going to Kiev as part of his education. And there were other, let's say, personal connections. So, for example, one of the more outstanding people whom this Kiev Center produced was Igor Lukashuk, who then in the 90s, at some point, late 90s, became to represent Russia and was a Russian member in the International Law Commission, and so on and so forth. But of course, the big picture of international law is also linked to some sort of civilizational values, civilizational approaches. I guess that when, in the end, because I noticed some years ago when President Putin started to say that the Security Council, permanent members of the Security Council should meet. They should discuss about the future of the world order. And for me, a bit like you saying that international law is a shield in power, for me it was, what? You want again to go back to 1945, that 5 great powers, Stalin and Roosevelt, they meet and then they discuss whether Albania is an equal country or not, as they did in 1945. But it was already visible in those statements that Putin is somehow, in the end, dissatisfied with the world order, if you want. By the way, another interesting aspect in his last speeches is his and Russian diplomacy's criticism of this American trope of international rules-based order. Like Putin keeps saying that, what are these and who saw those rules, which also this criticism reflects to some extent a different understanding of international law, a more positivist international law, which is again has also roots in the Soviet system, and maybe what we got in the 90s as our education, which is that international law is something that you always had to agree to very specifically. Because it comes from sovereignty, and if it is not agreed to specifically, then it is some sort of machination of powerful imperial countries like Britain or something. They have a big navy and then they tell us what the rules of the law of the sea or naval warfare are. And so there has been this, coming back to what you said before, there has been of course, Russia has referred to international law a lot, but I think that over time it has become more apparent that partly different things were meant by it, different values were meant by it. And in some ways, when Putin or Lavrov referred to the importance of international law, then their message really is that please respect what you agreed with Stalin in 1945. He fought hard for what he got. And this is international law, not your Western ideas about democracy and human rights and I don't know, universality of your values. This seems to be so it's a kind of civilizational herd power criticism of international law as understood in the West that I see there.
Okay, thanks. Igor, I would like to have your comment on this, because this was also one of my questions that I had prepared for myself. This the phrasing that Russian authorities have been using many times in the past years, that there is a sort of rules-based order being imposed by the West, which is put in opposition actually to the real healthy international law as meant by the authorities. And it's not that old, actually. I think it appeared in the last decade. I can't remember if they were using this in this sense of the opposition. But what would you say about that?
First of all, I would like to refer to what Patricia said about this case between Russia and Ukraine. It's a very interesting case. But I would like to suggest what would happen next and why Russia actually always actively participates in all those international cases. First of all, Russia will say that, of course, will provide the Kremlin will provide its arguments, its argumentation. Then the court will reject this argumentation. And Russian representatives would say that this court was pressed by the West. It was like kind of an institution which is dependent on the West and will continue. The Kremlin will continue maintaining this image of surrounded castle or tower, something like that. In the Kremlin, they pay a lot of attention to the public opinion polls. And they follow the propagandist rules. And one of them is, if you do not reply the statement of your enemy, it may be perceived that you agree with that you are weak. So anyway, you have to respond. Anyway. So in any case, Kremlin will respond. Anyway. Even if Kremlin understands that completely it has no chances to win this case, they will take part in that. They will participate, definitely. With regard to the perception of Russian perception of the international law, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that have a look at the post-Soviet countries and what kind of part of international law, argumentation, Russia uses with regard to Ukraine or with regard to Georgia, with regard to Moldova and other post-Soviet countries. Russia justifies its actions with the concept which is called solidarist approach to military intervention. That is, we have to protect citizens whose rights are violated by the government. We have to protect Russian speakers' rights. We have to protect the citizens of Crimea who cannot teach their children in Russian language. This is the concept proposed by Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General of the United Nations, responsibility to protect, actually. It means that, according to this concept, the international community should immediately deal with the cases when the government cannot guarantee the basic rights of its population. So actually, it was his idea. Many countries in the West supported this paradigm, but Russia, China, India, and other countries, they proceeded with the traditional understanding of military intervention based on sovereignty, on the concept of sovereignty. That is the pluralist approach to military intervention. When it comes to the cases of military intervention which takes place not on the territory of the post-Soviet state, Russia says, well, we have to respect sovereignty of the country. We have to respect it. So they use instrumentally the international law, even in this case, actually. And for the Russian authorities, the international law is a huge ocean where you can pick up one example and you can easily find something contradictory in contradiction. So you can pick up the point of self-determination of nations, and then someone can pick up and contradict it with the point that the borders have to be respected. So this is how they use it constantly. So this is purely instrumental in terms of both domestic and foreign policy.
Thank you. Dziękuję.
Can I just respond to Igor?
Yeah,
because
sure.
Right, I'll speak Polish because Igor understands Polish very well. I would be hesitant to underestimate Russian lawyers and the cases they participate in. And this is maybe an important question to Lauri. In his book, he shows a certain isolationism of the Russian way of teaching of international law, where they say this is the way we teach it, and there is a different science of international law which is taught abroad. But this is not to say that they don't know the arguments that the foreigners use. Russia has won the case that was started by Georgia at the ICC, And Russia won it in a way because it was discontinued as a result of the jurisdiction issue. So it was a Georgian case. Right now, there are two cases between Ukraine and Russia. And if you look at who represents Russia, you'll see these are not just good Russian lawyers, but there are some eminent foreign lawyers. Professor Fortin from France, Alain Pelin, Wordsworth from the United Kingdom, Zimmermann from Germany. These are eminent lawyers. So Russia treats these court cases very seriously because Russia wants to win with its arguments that will hopefully convince the West. And the speeches by Putin are full of international law arguments. We don't buy that. He doesn't persuade us. But I remember 2014, and the arguments he used then managed to convince a large portion of the West, including some lawyers. Now, this scenario that Igor has painted, that they will lose it, so they will say, well, it's just a Western court, and they will ignore it. Yes, it is very likely. But let's remember the situation when Russia was removed from the Council of Europe. So the European Court of Human Rights was closed for Russian issues for some time. What was the reaction of the lawyers who dealt with human rights in Russia? They were devastated. They said that this was an instrument that they could have used, and it was taken away from them. And they would say, yes, we know that everybody writes about Russia not respecting the rulings of the Court of Human Rights, but at a lower, more practical level, we saw that the argument that the Court of Human Rights decided something worked in the case of local lawyers. Now, I often train my students for all sorts of international law competitions. This also includes humanitarian law and others. And there are always Russian teams on these competitions. They're always very well prepared. They have very good arguments. So my question to Lauri is, do you acknowledge the fact that Russians find it very easy to juggle arguments? Sometimes they use arguments from the Russian style of international law teaching, but if they need it, they use Western school of international law and they hire eminent Western lawyers.
We have to also keep in mind, Patricia, is not so flattering to us, but many segments in the society think that all lawyers are sort of liars. That this is part of the profession. This juggling, finding for arguments, in a way, legal sociologists would say that this is kind of what lawyers do. In some ways, they don't, go in contradiction with. There are certain limits, like you mentioned Alain Pelé. So for Alain Pelé, the annexation of Crimea was fine. He said he could kind of live with that, but now after February 22, he thought it was too much, and then he cancelled his participation in representing Russia. No, it has been interesting that Russia, in those international high-profile cases, it has kind of favored Western lawyers. So in that sense, maybe it's a matter of trust, or maybe simply those foreign ministry lawyers, they do not trust these younger generation international lawyers who have received education abroad. I don't know exactly why this is, but they're very, I haven't seen prominent Russian law professors making the case for those Russian views. But because so many of our listeners are also, not international lawyers, I want to clarify one thing about this International Court of Justice and so on, what winning and losing means there. Because international law is based originally on state sovereignty. Then this jurisdiction, we lawyers call it jurisdiction of international courts, is not automatic. And in some ways, here is where history becomes important, because the Soviet Union, for example, hardly wanted to recognize the jurisdiction of international courts. So they sent judges to the ICJ, but the Soviet Union never had any cases because they would not recognize the jurisdiction. So only at the time of perestroika, some windows of opportunity in terms of jurisdiction were created. So the challenge for countries like Georgia and Ukraine is not to say whether some harm was done to them, but they have to prove that they have these jurisdiction on those very narrow limits based on the specific multilateral international treaties. So Russia's victory in, for example, as in this case for Georgia, is not really that the court would say in any way that what you did was right, but basically that there was no way for the court to look into it, which is an important limit of international law that we, in this sense, also as not international lawyers must understand.
Before I ask one more question from me to our panelists, please, I would like you to be part of the discussion. So if you have any questions already, just in a couple of minutes, I will give the floor to you. If not, I have a one-page long list of questions. So, but and the same for those who are watching online. You can send the questions as well. When I was listening to you, and I started to think about, in political terms, what actually has happened after February. Meaning, things that were unthinkable 10 months ago are now just happening on our eyes. Not related to the international law only, but let's say freezing of central bank reserves of Russia, located in many central banks around the world. If someone asked a year ago, would it be possible? The answer would be no, it's a crazy thing. Full energy decoupling of the EU and Russia, which is painful, which is not easy, but a year ago it seemed unthinkable even. Now it's just happening. So the question is, getting back to the law, what is too much for lawyers in terms of political developments, international political developments, that make them think about unthinkable things that are not there today in the treaties, that you have to somehow invent. I know it's a difficult question because it's rather political, but as after 45, when there was sort of the revolution when it comes to everything, there was a need to invent new tools, new institutions, new thinking about the whole regulatory sphere. Now, of course, we don't know still what the end of the war will be, but definitely it just makes the world upside down when it comes to many issues. So can you think right now about things that can be implemented or proposed when it comes to the further development of international norms, given that, of course, everything depends on the will of the states? We don't have any authority over them. That can be done. For instance, if it is over, because now it's difficult. Is it too abstract question from me as a layman? So please, Lauri, Igor.
Maybe Igor wants to try. It's a very interesting question, very big, huge, and first of all, we have to realize that it's not about the international law. It's about the Russia's attitudes with regard to international law. So Russia has to change its attitude with regard to international law. I mean, I would fix here something rather than with international law. That's first. Second, we have to keep in mind that the system that has been created after the end of the Second World War, the United Nations, its bodies and institutions, they were, and the Security Council in the center of it, it was created as a timely measure. the winners in this war, the countries, especially in the West, they believe that, well, we have to create something now, and sometime later the system will become more equal. Have a look at the Security Council. Can you see the principle, the embodiment of principle of equality of sovereignties? Some countries have the power of veto, some not. But have a look at the United Nations Charter. Well, the very Security Council is a sharp contradiction to norms and principles of the United Nations Charter. Like, but it doesn't mean that we have to just destroy it. And we don't right now. We don't have anything instead of it. So we have the international law practices, international law bodies which deal with international law. So the problem with the countries that violate their own obligations with regard to international law, not with international law itself. So we have to keep in mind.
So thanks for this. I will make my question more specific to you as lawyers, but not be that political. Can we think about now unfreezing the world of 45 when it comes to United Nations and Security Council? Is there any thinking around in the legal scholars environment about that kind of, what kind of techniques we can use to make it happen? If there is anything that lawyers can do without, I mean, there must be political will. I know that, but can we somehow change the system without destroying this and building a new? Is there any way to do this?
I think it is happening. Just if you look, for example, that in the 1998 we managed to create International Criminal Court without support of the big powers, and I would say with huge opposition from the United States, Russia and China, but we did prove that we can build the institution even without big powers. And for example, if you look at the system 1945, and it was agreed, we didn't have to even write in the UN Charter that always into the International Court of Justice we select Russian judge, we select American judge and so on, because we thought that in the main institutions always we need to have representative of those P5, of those permanent members of the Security Council. But in the recent years, we could learn that suddenly British candidate was not elected to the ICJ, but the candidate from India was elected instead. We could learn, for example, that the International Law Commission states didn't elect US representative. She didn't receive she didn't receive enough votes. We could see that in other bodies, Russian candidate or French candidate was not elected. So I wouldn't say that we are able to destroy Security Council or to change Security Council the way, how does it work? But we can, in innovative way, use other tools, other procedures to show we can do it something even without you. Yeah, so this is, and I think that we need to remember about this, that the tools are already there. You also ask whether we need to invent some new terms, notions, institutions. Sometimes I think it's the question of the interpretation. Now there is a huge discussion, what about immunity? Because of course, and Lauri is also writing about this in his book. The question in Russia, you had a huge belief that we need to protect absolute immunity of the state and of its representatives. And now when we want to, we talk about creation of this special tribunal to prosecute crime of aggression, there is a discussion, okay, but what about immunity of the highest representatives of Russia? And this is the moment when states can say, well, we need to change this rule. We need to change this principle. We need to go into different direction. But this is the question of the, international law is so beautiful and so complicated that because you not only you have treaties, but also you have customary law. And customary law is made by practice of the states. So this practice can be always changed.
Thank you. Lauri.
Well, one of the big questions about international law historically radiating to our days is the question to what extent international law ever was or currently is universal. We always assume when we talk about it, really doesn't matter if it's in what continent, in what context, but of course people who come to study, let's say, also the history of international law, one can see a lot of non-universality there. And one specific accusation that gets to be made about international law, it's historical Eurocentrism, that it is a lot about what international law has been somehow defined based on European cases, examples, affairs, and historically Russia used to be part of this. 18th, 19th century Russia is a participant in this story of defining international law like this. Now, I'm a little bit having a different take here than Patricia. Why? Because I haven't noticed, for example, extreme enthusiasm currently among Western countries to advocate some sort of fundamental change of the UN system, UN Security Council system, because some of the, even West European countries, they are holding their breath because they realize that if the present world order goes, the stakes of European countries will not rise it. Like, there's no way, if today everyone goes back to the drawing board, they start to appoint some sort of directorium of the world as the Security Council is, there's no way that there would be basically 3 out of 5 powers, if we say that Russia is European, to the extent that it is, 3 out of 5 are European. It's not going to happen. There will be India and who knows, representatives of different, and therefore, I would provocatively and paradoxically say that Russia and the West, to some extent, have a common interest that the current world order of 1945 would not disappear completely, because it's not certain that they would get a better position in the something completely new.
That's really an interesting thing about this alliance of Europe and Russia when it comes to the system, and if you put it against this constant claims of Russian MFA that Europe, meaning European Union, is nothing but just sort of the toothless animal, just without any political power, then it also is it looks interesting. Bardzo proszę, czy są jakieś pytania?
Do we have any questions from the audience? Please introduce yourself. Alicja Curanowicz.
In English, I have a question for Professor Mälksoo. Right. I have 2 questions, actually. In your book, you show that Russia is instrumental about law and it's connected to power politics and Israel's vision of international order, right, of states and so on. My question is, how do you see the role of justice in Russia's approach to law? Because, as you know, in Russian tradition, it's quite often to juxtapose justice and law. And this could be one of the reasons why for so many Russians, not just Vladimir Putin, right, annexation of Crimea was legitimate. Не совсем легально, но справедливо, right? So it was illegal, but it was fair, right? So how does it play into Russia's approach and understanding of international law? And my second question is, you make such a nice disclaimer in the beginning of your book, like, I'm Estonian, but I don't think I'm biased. I'm just going to critically assess Russia because I have good grounds to do it. And this is a familiar situation to many Polish scholars who deal with Russia. Do you often have situations like this, that you have to really make a good case because you're Estonian? It's so much harder to be critical about Russia because so many other scholars can say you're simply biased. Yeah, thank you.
Well, maybe starting from this second question, I think I have maybe recently started to care less about it. But also when I introduce this theme in the book, I say that, of course, that everyone is biased, except that if you come from Cambridge or Heidelberg, then we don't mention that. Then it is, it is assumed that you are a representative of international law, having all these famous pedigree of important people who, of course, spoke about international law somehow objectively. Of course, they didn't, but they were in a kind of position to be sold in such a way. And here's where Russia is very interesting. Like on the one hand, Russia has been such a powerful actor, 1945, but on the other hand, there is constantly this feeling, I think, also in Russian academia of some sort of inferiority, some sort of castle. We have to defend ourselves. We are not part of this. Of course, if we go to The Hague, then there will be other people making the rules there, and somehow this sort of I don't know, like on the one hand, strong actor, on the other hand, liminal, peripheral actor, and about justice. Well, it's, yes, one favorite trope of Russia since already the Soviet period is the trope of Western double standards, for example. So they would say that the Americans, they speak about the importance of human rights, but look at what they do in Nicaragua. And it's kind of often true, this criticism, except that, there are other Americans who actually believe in human rights, who want, I don't know, so all these inconsistencies in a power's behavior, they do not nullify, I don't know, this believing in some of those somehow fundamental values. When Putin announced the war, it was interesting that he kind of made the argument about the international legal argument this time in a sort of lukewarm way, because in the end he said in this TV speech that, but anyway, truth and justice are on our side, so don't worry about it. Whatever they say, they will start attacking now, saying that we violated this and that, but truth and justice are on our side. And I think one of the themes in the book is also a little bit troublesome, in the sense I don't have myself final answers to that. What if truth and justice are such concepts which to some extent are somehow civilizational, that we cannot fully agree on them? Like when you say, for example, that Russia so obviously violates international law, what is there even to talk about? I am also raising the possibility as a question in my book, that what if these fights are continuations of medieval fights about what is the right way to believe in God, and we can never agree to that. Like, if you sincerely, genuinely believe that truth and justice are on your side about Crimea, for example, what can international law do? It's international law in that sense cannot be all powerful. I think truth and justice, of course, are more powerful, more all comprising concepts. Except that we can seldom all just agree and nail down what they mean. But thank you for interesting questions.
I mean, I think you have to lose the war to accept certain changes. I mean, you're totally right. Please, another question.
I have one very specific question and one more general question. Specific question is do you see any continuity of the concepts of limited sovereignty in Soviet Union? Actually, when they invaded 1968 Prague, right? Their slogan was limited sovereignty. So in some sense, I find myself very often to understand limited sovereignty is sort of USSR's version of universal human rights. It's just revolution replaced human rights in their understanding or in their way of legitimatizing their invasion of Prague. So, but in the international law, I see in the more general level, I see the certain hypocrisy or contradiction between the principle of sovereignty and universal human rights. So that kind of contradiction or hypocrisies can be also found in the Russian approach to Crimean questions and the rights of the Russian national minorities in Ukraine, also Western approach or American approach to the Ukrainian question. Also, we can make a comparison with the American invasion to Iraq or American intervention in Afghanistan. Do you see any significant difference between Russian invasion to Ukraine and the American invasion to Afghanistan and Iraq?
I think, Lauri.
I think we have to distinguish between the US invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq in international law sense, because I think the invasion of Afghanistan, although it ended up in a long-term, let's say, non-success, obviously we all understand that, it was better covered with international law. Essentially, there were Security Council resolutions that at least could be understood as allowing that, initially. Whether it was a politically, well-done thing is another matter, but it has been less contested because of those Security Council resolutions. And yeah, is there any different? I think the motivations are different. The contexts are different. The Americans did not stay in Iraq to somehow annex it, to say that this is now part of the American world. But probably in terms of violating UN Charter, it was not so different in terms of if you use force. And this is Russia loves that argument. They find those things when Western powers misbehave and say that, by the way, why can't we do that? If we are all equal, then if you can violate international law, then who are you to say that we can't? But perhaps others will add.
I have additional argument also about the difference, because I think that in 2003, when we talk about invasion against Iraq, this was the violation of the UN Charter. I would say that it was even aggression. With Afghanistan, we have also certain doubts, but because there is no problem with the attacking Al-Qaeda as such, but to change the regime in Afghanistan and to fight with Talibs, this is much more controversial. But there is one legal argument which I would use. When you look at the definition of aggression adopted in 1974 by the General Assembly, you will see that one of the acts of aggression, they say, okay, invasion is aggression, but then occupation is aggression, and annexation is also aggression. So sometimes we say that this is triple aggression. And so, for example, in the situation when the result is annexation of the territory of another state, so you used the force because you wanted to combat the territory of another state, this is the huge difference. And this is what Lauri just mentioned, that, okay, in Iraq, they changed the regime, but they didn't take the territory of Iraq, and they didn't say this is a new US territory. In case of Ukraine, we are talking about the perspective that they want to include part of the Ukrainian territory in the framework of the Russian borders. And this is something which we didn't observe for a very, very long time. Lauri mentioned in his book the famous example from 1991, when there was a general understanding between the West and Russia that we need to react to the aggression of Iraq against Kuwait. Yeah, and that there was a common understanding. Maybe this was the result of the weakness of Russia, but this was the example when one state wanted to take the territory of another state. And it was crystal clear that this is prohibited, that this is aggression. What Russia is doing now, by taking the territory of Ukraine, this is crystal clear, this is aggression. Because whatever definition of aggression you would take, from the Russian international law, from the Western international law, from the South international law, always this kind of the use of force would be called as aggression.
And you had another theme in your question, another interesting feature about, for example, Putin's recent rhetoric is to point out in his mind that many countries believe they are sovereign, but it's erroneous to think so. In reality, with this US Western hegemony, the world is so that many countries in reality are what he calls half colonies. So they are not really sovereign. The few countries like Russia who resist the US, they are the last remaining, sovereign countries. And because you asked about this, in a way, hypocrisies that are related to sovereignty in the era before, let's say, First World War, you had officially notions like protectorates or vassal states. Nowadays we have indeed in the UN Charter this idea of sovereign equality of states. But now Putin brings this rhetoric back. He says that, why these 145, for example, saying that this is aggression, annexation is not allowed, 43, excuse me, if it's true that they are no longer sovereign, if it's true that they are vassals, then it doesn't matter what they say. Right? So in this sense, it's also a sort of self-serving argument for today's Russian government that, probably countries like Estonia, they are not sovereign if they ever were.
My colleagues already presented quite a number of arguments which deal with the difference between the Iraq case and Ukraine case, and I would add one more. Actually, we have to remember that Russia's military aggression with regard to Ukraine started not in 2022, but in 2014. And the Venice Commission issued its opinion about the annexation of Crimea. And there was one very important point there, that Russia had not raised this issue about human rights violation, about territorial claims, and so on and so forth previously. And this contradicts the international practice and law. With regard to Iraq, it was clearly a matter. It was on the table. What Saddam Hussein did with his own population was on the table in Security Council and UN General Assembly. In my opinion.
Not make right. So it's just an instrument being used by Russia to just superficial commonalities between certain events and political actions to amplify their own argumentation. That's at least my point of view. And we had the same case when it comes to Crimea and Kosovo. I mean, on the surface, we might pretend it was similar, but we know that deep down it was quite different. I mean, in many aspects. We have a question from YouTube, actually, a viewer. I will try to translate this into English. How exactly, because we said that actually Russia has been using legal argumentation to even support their aggression against Ukraine, how exactly do they argue that it was in line with international law? That's the essence of the question. The rest is just a commentary. So, what are the arguments? I mean,
one specific argument is President Putin has referred to the United Nations Charter, Article 1, Paragraph 2, which mentions self-determination of peoples. And this is a very interesting reference and tells us a lot about the historical trajectory of how Russia uses international law, because until, let's say, Crimea, Russia was always saying that territorial integrity trumps claims of self-determination. Now, Igor said very interestingly that international law for leading Russian lawyers is often like a sea or ocean of different arguments in which you pick. So it was fascinating when Putin was in his Crimea speech in 2014, he made a reference to what Americans said in the Kosovo independence proceedings in the International Court of Justice. And at the, but forgetting to say that Russia said the opposite. So Russia had the Russian argument until that speech, and then Putin says that, but you know what the American argument was? So there was a kind of U-turn, and in that sense also, this article was never understood. Actually, by none of the states, really, in the way that because of self-determination we can break up states. Because if you would say so, then I'm sorry, but Hitler was right. Because there were German minorities in Czechoslovakia and Poland. So if that is the basis of international relations, we can break up other states. We can try to see that, each ethnicity gets to belong to their mother country of their ethnicity. Then in that case, Hitler was not wrong. But the whole point of the world order of 1945 was also to say that Hitler had been wrong. in making those attacks. So I guess, but this is an example of and it is kind of used probably in a way that is, to some extent for the ignorance, for the ones who don't know about international law, what Russia or Soviet Union have previously said about international law. But it's interesting that they would start with this, like a reference to law. Law says something else. The article doesn't say that. It doesn't say that you can break up states because the self-determination is mentioned there. But he would start his speech with that.
Igor, please follow up.
It's absolutely true. And it's interesting that when the Russian parliament adopted the legislation with regard to the occupied and annexed territories, I mean Zaporizhia, Zaporizhska Oblast, Kherson Oblast, this Donetsk and Luhansk, they used only one reference to the international law, and that was right of determination. But this is extremely dangerous for Russia. When they use this, I mean, just imagine the biggest country, I mean, in terms of territory, the biggest country in the world, full-man separatism on its borders, and uses this only it was not only it was not only starting from 2014. I mean, after the war in Georgia, when Russia recognized the independence of the South Ossetia and Abkhazia, they already at that time referred to the right of the people to self-determination. But previously, of course, yes, the rhetoric was different. And what is interesting that I mean, it's a big problem when you approach Russian scholars in international law, and you say that, well, okay, well, Crimea, you annexed Crimea, but what about Kosovo, the Kosovo case? In this logic, in this framework, Russia has to recognize the independence of Kosovo. I mean, if Russia wants to be consequential, otherwise it is something that reminds manipulation or double standards, whatever. So this is interesting, and they cannot answer this question.
Yes, Patricia.
In this discussion, we are focusing on the use of force issues. We mentioned Crimea, we mentioned the events from this year, and I know that this right to self-determination was one of the most important arguments, but I must stress that Russia used various arguments in different forums, like intervention on invitation, like right to self-defense, to protect your own people, responsibility to protect. You could see the whole variation of different arguments. But for me, what is the most disturbing is the fact, and maybe we should put a little bit light on it, that Russia has beautiful history, beautiful impact on the development of the law of armed conflicts, of international humanitarian law. Martin's Clause, then their involvement in the negotiations of the Geneva Conventions and additional protocols, when this was really Soviet states' impact to have better law, better in these terms that would protect more civilians. So on the level of the state argumentation, Russia is perfect. When we talk about perfect, Russia is strongly supporting protection of civilians. But then when you look at the law in the field and you see Bucha, you see people tortured, killed, mass graves, and so on, we cannot understand how this cannot be implemented, on the lower level. And this is what we observed not only in this war, but in many previous wars in which Russia was involved, including Syria, for example. That Russia would argue in the Security Council that we cannot use weapon which leaves explosive remnants of war, and then uses cluster munition on massive way. Yeah? We cannot torture people. We should apply principle of proportionality more strictly to protect civilians, and then you see all those crimes which we could observe in media. So you can really see that on the level of politicians, they officially support international humanitarian law, but on the level of implementation by soldiers, they force and to threaten to terror people is much more important. And this is, I think, one of the most disturbing patterns of Russian and Soviet wars.
Just one more very specific question from the lawyer, actually, on the Facebook to the lawyers. How far, according to international law, can other countries go in military aid to Ukraine today? Can you somehow, I mean, it's very specific, very practical in a sense, but what can you say about that?
For me, the limits to that are not legal, strictly speaking, but political. Like, for example, when the French president says that we provide military help, but to the point that, Ukraine cannot attack Russian territory, it is, or in defense even, it is a kind of political line, especially considering that there is a fundamental disagreement on what Russian territory is, right? For Putin has repeatedly made it clear that for us now Crimea is the Russian territory. Don't say anything else. It might be criminally punishable within Russia. And also, already now providing weapons to Ukraine, Putin has said that you guys are taking part in it. It's now a Western war against. So, in that sense, already, if that is the case, then the consequences, how the other side respond, this is more like almost like a political question. It's like, I think the line cannot be drawn in a legally obvious sense anymore.
I would agree with Lauri, and I would add just one thing, that legally I wouldn't see any limits, having in mind that we have the situation when we have aggressor and the victim, and according to the UN Charter, according to the whole idea of the Jus Cogens norms, so the norms from which you do not have an exception, all states in the world they do not have right, they are obliged to do whatever is possible to stop the aggressor. So they are even obliged to help Ukraine and to not help Russia, of course. This is law, yeah? But on the level of politics, and when we talk about Security Council and UN Charter, this politics you can see in the Security Council, because we gave some special rights to the permanent members, we see that it is not so easy, especially if the permanent member has nuclear power and we are afraid. And the main aim of the UN was to save the future generations from the war. So this is the fear which is in everyone's hands, to avoid further escalations, yeah? If we promised to save people from the war.
Lauri, would you like to?
Just to stir and make it more pluralistic, if a representative of Russian government would be here, he would say that, but here's where you guys from the West are complete hypocrites, because what you say about Jus Cogens and so on, then how come that 2003, 13 East Central European national leaders wrote this letter supporting US and UK intervention against Iraq? So where was Jus Cogens then?
And this wouldn't be only Russian argument, but this would be argument of many African or Asian states. And they would say, why are you now so ferocious, to support Ukraine? Where were you in 2003? Where were you in so many other interventions? Yeah, and this is not argument which we can ignore. That's why we need to respond to this argument, to say, and you mentioned this, that, okay, we made certain mistakes, we didn't react properly, not all of us reacted properly, but maybe now this is the moment when we need to have the general understanding how we should react in this kind of situation. And maybe now the fact that we went with this to the General Assembly, where you have representatives of all states members of the UN, maybe this is the direction in which we should go, that we, in democratic way, with all the mistakes and sins of democracy, we can now work on new procedures to address future violations, which definitely would happen, not only from Russia, but from other states. So we should always react in very similar way, remembering what the law is.
Thank you. We have a question here. Where's the mic, please? But for translation.
Yeah, I think what you said is really a little bit too small for me. You cannot say we made mistake. Did we make just a mistake in Chile? Did we make just a mistake in Panama? Did we just make a mistake in Katanga? Did the French just made mistakes? They're in an intervention, military intervention, whenever they want, whenever their interest is in jeopardy, and whether they want to integrate Katanga or Congo, well, they want it for a long time. Whether you want to integrate it really in your own state is not the question. I mean, the Americans, they had the power with Pinochet for 20 years. In Panama, still they have it. Whatever happens, you remember that the president of Panama, well, he did some crimes, but he was in a American jail, and so on and so on. So you cannot just say I understand that we are now in a very special situation, and we are opposed. Me too. I see it a little bit different, but I'm opposed about this manslaughter and so on and so on. And we are fixed on this situation, but we cannot ignore that for 50 years the turn was the other one, and we cannot just mention it as a mistake. We have to emancipate. Europe has to emancipate from the Americans and from Russia. We have to have our own standpoint, and what we did now, we are exactly repeating. We are now in the influence of the United States once more, with arms, with gas, and so on and so on. We are not emancipating to have an own standpoint.
But please have also one more thing in mind, that when you use the examples from the past, don't forget that we also have some progress in the development of international law. Because few decades ago, if I would say about jus cogens peremptory norms, nobody would even use this term. ICJ was afraid to use this term. Now, for example, with the new works of the International Law Commission, when representatives of different states, they try to make a list to understand what does it mean, how we should react, this is something completely new. You didn't have this 20, 30 or 40 years ago. So that's why, like, I know that many representatives would love to keep the order from 1945, and Lauri explained why, but at the same time, don't forget that we made huge progress. There was 1999 Kosovo, and that's why we had a whole discussion about responsibility to protect. And that's why we had a whole discussion that it cannot be repeated in this way. Then you have 2003, and once again, it was not that, the whole West applauded. Just think about the protests in Germany, and that many states said, no, we will not take part in this. That Europe was divided at that time because they were not convinced by those arguments. So I think that we had some lesson in 2003. We also, like 2001 Afghanistan, I really studied very closely the literature which was published in 2001. In the very first months, everybody supported US, everybody, including Russia, yeah? And then a few months afterwards, there was a reflection, but maybe we went too far. Why we didn't make a distinction between one and others. So I think, of course, I understand your frustration.
But Afghanistan is not 20 years ago. Afghanistan and really the mistreating of the whole people, even of your own people there. After this, it's not in the past. It was happening even in nearly
and don't you see this progress?
It was a shame. We should be ashamed about it.
And don't you see this progress that U.S. was forced to prosecute certain soldiers for those crimes? Or, for example, that you had proceeding which started in the International Criminal Court concerning Afghanistan, which was unimaginable for U.S. So I wouldn't say that these are huge steps, but I would say that certain steps which are undertaken by the international community to make change, even without support of big powers.
But there are some pills to compare.
Let the panelists answer. Igor.
Yes, as far as understood, the argument behind your statement, you want the United States to be humiliated publicly. But I have a question to you. Is Ukraine Europe? You said that Europe has to emancipate from the United States and Russia. Is Ukraine Europe?
Of course it is Europe. I have no doubt about it. It's not a question that I want to defend what the Russians are doing there. Only I just want to have this stop. And when you say whatever it takes, we have to defend and we have to use any arms, this will leave us to a situation where we will get lost. It's really dangerous, because I know it from the Green Party in Germany, Whatever it takes, we will fight. We will use any arm, whatever it is. It's impossible. It will bring us really to the earth.
Excuse me, but how can you imagine Europe emancipating from the United States when we can see how the United States and the United Kingdom are heavily engaged in helping Ukraine, while Germany and France, they just, well, they help, but not that much. How do you see this emancipation? I cannot understand.
And just to add one more thing, I wouldn't say that we are able to, and we are willing to use whatever.
Can we have the microphone, please?
I wouldn't say that we want to use whatever weapon we have in our hands. It's not this point. But for example, some Western European states are accused that they are selling certain military stuff to Russia. So I'm sorry, but this must be stressed that you cannot support Russia in any way. And this would also make certain change. You don't have to sell weapon, maybe start from not supporting Russia in its military conduct.
Lauri, would you like to add to this heated debate? Political rather than...
Yeah, I guess my feeling about this is that we all, I mean nations or political thinkers, we have some grievances about the past. Let's say the human history, human political history is very far from perfect. And my problem is that I would like to see, let's say, this idea of non-use of force as so strong that we don't kind of... And yes, and therefore we should also say, at least in retrospect, that, you know, what happened in 2003 in Iraq was in violation of the UN Charter and full period. But the difficulty with those always, you know, coming also with those grievances is that they have this tendency of kind of justifying, because if you are saying that, you know, maybe Ukraine and Estonia shouldn't support Ukraine so much because we were not so vocal about some African conflict, which to some extent is also very human. By the way, maybe it's partly the problem with this overemphasizing the universality of international law, that we are not somehow morally allowed to think in regional terms anymore, although it's obvious that in terms of human empathy and so on, we tend to feel more empathy with the misery that happens near our doorsteps and so on. But my problem is that, again, I'm very interested in those parallels, you know, between now and World War II, or, for example, Putin's and Hitler's thinking's comparisons. Like what I understand from history is that some of Hitler's grievances made sense in 1939. But one of the lessons that the international community learned from that is that you don't solve these things by aggressive war. And I would like us to keep that lesson somehow, because once we let this go, then, you know, it's going to be open to new adventures, and there will be other grievances, and there will be more than 1 million dead somewhere in faraway places.
Okay, thank you. Last question, please.
Hello, my name is Grzegorz Szymborski. I would like to ask actually 2 questions, if possible. Very short ones. First one, the general one. You mentioned Kosovo case and self-determination issue. I would like you to ask to what degree you believe that without Kosovo case in 1999 and then the self-determination of Kosovo, the arguments on the Russian side for this self-determination in South Ossetia, then Crimea, Lugansk, Donetsk, wouldn't have been used as a means of the Russian policy. The fixation of Putin on Ukraine is widely known, but the question is, if not the West that first touched this very serious topic, don't you believe that the invasion of Ukraine would have become earlier than in 2022? To some extent, it seems right now in this year that Putin was just fed up with the concept of self-determination he tried to utilize through the last 8 years. That's the first question. A second one specifically to Professor Mälksoo about Russian-Estonian dispute over the treaty on the border. Shortly before the start of invasion in early February, Russian side wanted to resume the negotiations on the treaty for the first time since 2014. I would like to ask you, to what extent do you think that it was just a side effect on the pressure on Ukraine with all those troops deployed already on the border, and that Russia tried to hit two birds with one stone, to threat both Ukraine on one side and Estonia on the other, and how the invasion of Ukraine changed the approach of Estonia towards the idea of signing any treaty with Russia under such circumstances? Thank you.
Kosovo, yes. It's a very interesting question, very interesting situation. I would say that Russia's attitude and Russia's approaches with regard to international issues and conflicts are very dependent on what's going on and what was going on inside Russia. Because in 1993, when unexpectedly extreme right populist party headed by Lauri Mälksoo won the parliamentary election, everyone in the Kremlin understood that there was a need to take over this nationalist narrative, otherwise Yeltsin risked to lose power. Already in January '94, Russia's stance with regard to Bosnia became more rigid, more controversial. In 1995, the crisis in Bosnia was more or less kind of Russia was ready to negotiate it and to negotiate this crisis, and even there were attempts to hold negotiations, secret negotiations in Moscow between all the sides of the conflict. But in 1998, there was a default in Russia, economic crisis. So at that time, there was a need to shift the focus of Russian population from the domestic problems to somewhere else and to demonstrate some victories for Yeltsin. Before that moment, before that very moment, Russia was very, very cooperable with regard to the Yugoslavian issues. But after that, well, Yeltsin tried to use that in order to increase his popularity ratings. So when they held the negotiations in France, actually in February, Russia sent not someone very important, but former Mr. Boris Mayorsky, who was a former ambassador to Angola, if I'm not mistaken. Angola, I mean, former ambassador of Angola. Just it was a clear sign that Russia was not going to negotiate seriously this issue. So that's why bombing started, and then Russian position was not that cooperable, was in times very aggressive. So they wanted to demonstrate Russia's will, Russia's kind of specificity to raise the popularity ratings inside Russia. So in my opinion, if not that default in 1998 in August, this kind
But, you know, well, to cut the story short is that Estonia had a slightly different treaty in borders in the interwar period in the east. And then 1944 already Russia took like 5% took it unilaterally back, and Estonia's as well as Latvia's state, let's say, doctrine in the 90s that we are restoring the previous state. So inevitably, initially it was understood that please now return us this 5% of territory that you took away. But the lessons that politicians also learned already in the mid-90s, that they, first of all, Russia just shrugs shoulders. I mean, we're not giving territories back to anyone like that. You realize that, right? Nor did it raise a lot of enthusiasm in the West in terms of our quest to become members of NATO and EU, so they dropped it. But there has always been in Estonian politics a sort of, I don't even know if far right is the right word, but some sort of minority that says that no, but we have to do like Japan. We wait out and see if this, because if it was in terms of as a sort of violation of treaty, then we in principle can get it back, or we should just wait and see what happens with Russia. But that's not the mainstream view in Estonia. And what was interesting is that the border treaty. There are two border treaties, one for the land border and the other for the sea border. They were signed in February 2014, about a week before these Crimea events. So I cannot prove it, but I imagine that one of the reasons could have been that Russia, because I think as it came kind of unexpectedly, the initiative could have come from Russia. At that time, the foreign ministry wanted to distinguish those cases that we do something in Ukraine, but it doesn't mean we have the same intentions with you. But of what Putin thought about where Ukraine belongs.
Terms. So either or. I see it rather as a process, and Patricia mentioned this. I mean, the sort of evolution. We sometimes make 2 steps ahead and then 1 step back. The question is whether we move in the right direction. So this is the first point. The second point, we need to think about this as a continuum, in my opinion. So between the situation when there's the law of force on one hand and the power of law on the other. And this is not we'll not be just jumping from one side to the other. We're just moving from one place to another. And today, I believe support for Ukraine, for the survival, is something that pushes the pendulum into the right direction. Iraq and the whole debate about Iraq, in my perspective, I would be very happy. I would be extremely happy if we had in Russia the same kind of debate about Crimea and Ukraine as we still have in the US about Iraq. I would love that. I would love that. The self-criticism, despite the grievous mistakes and sins, whatever you like it. So this is what I wish for Russia, to have a serious debate within their own country about what they are doing today. And the last point, the book is much richer than the debate here. So I can only just recommend to all of you here in the hall and who are watching us, please look into it. This is really well written, not for the academic audience, although it is very rigorous in terms of academic stuff, but it is written for the people interested in international relations, international law, Russia, and everything in between. So it is available on our not sure the website because our website is still, we are working on it, but you call us, you write to us, you will get it. So I just can recommend you because it's really excellent, excellent book. Thank you all for the presence here. Thank you all for your remarks and commentaries. And please join me in thanking our panelists. I zapraszam na kolejne.
And you're all invited to our further debates. We'll keep you posted. Thank you.